Title: The Distance Between Us. The rain had started falling just as Emily turned the key in her apartment door. She paused, hearing the soft patter of drops against the window panes, and sighed. It was almost poetic, like the universe itself understood the tumultuous swirl of emotions inside her. Or maybe it was just mocking her. As she stepped inside, the familiar warmth of her small, cluttered living room wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. It wasn't much, but it was hers, an oasis from the chaos of the world outside. She slipped off her wet shoes and padded softly across the hardwood floor, her mind already racing ahead to what she knew was inevitable. Luke. She had spent the past hour sitting in her car outside his building, trying to muster the courage to go up and see him. But the thought of facing him, of confronting the unspoken tension that had been simmering between them for months, was too much to bear. So, instead, she had driven home, where she could hide from the truth for a little while longer. But, as she stood there, staring at the soft glow of the lamp in the corner, she knew it was pointless. The truth was already here, in this room with her, clinging to her like the dampness of her rain-soaked clothes. The phone on the table buzzed, breaking her reverie. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she saw Luke's name flash on the screen. For a moment, she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. But she knew she couldn't avoid this forever. She couldn't avoid him forever. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as she answered the call. Where are you?" His voice was deep, familiar, tinged with concern. It sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of all the times that voice had been her anchor in a storm. "I'm home," she replied, though the words felt like a lie. Home wasn't a place, it was a person. And that person was Luke. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Emily could almost see the way his brow furrowed in that endearing way it always did when he was worried. She could picture him standing in his living room, running a hand through his dark hair, his green eyes searching the room as if he might find her there. "You were supposed to come over," he said finally, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "I know," Emily whispered, her chest tightening. She closed her eyes, leaning against the wall for support as she fought to keep the tears at bay. "I'm sorry, Luke. I needed some time to think." "About what?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had gone unsaid between them. Emily swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. How could she possibly explain the war that had been raging inside her for so long? How could she tell him that every time she was near him, it felt like her heart was being pulled in two different directions, that she was terrified of what would happen if she let herself fall, but even more terrified of what would happen if she didn't? "About us?" she said finally, the words barely more than a whisper. There was another pause, and Emily could hear the faint sound of his breathing on the other end of the line. She wondered what he was thinking, if he was feeling the same way she was. But then again, how could he? Luke had always been so sure of himself, so confident in everything he did. He was the kind of man who knew what he wanted and went after it without hesitation. "I'm coming over," Luke said suddenly, his tone brooking no argument. "Luke, no!" But before she could finish, he had already hung up, leaving her standing there with the phone still pressed to her ear. Emily felt a surge of panic rise within her as she stared at the now silent phone. He was coming, and this time there would be no running away. When the knock came at her door, Emily's heart was pounding so loudly in her chest she was sure he would be able to hear it. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before she opened the door. Luke stood there, rain-soaked and beautiful, his dark hair clinging to his forehead, his green eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her knees go weak. For a moment neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the kind of tension that made her want to reach out and touch him, just to see if it would break, or if it would ignite something even more dangerous. He said finally, his voice rough with emotion as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound of the rain outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them in this small, enclosed space. Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers she wasn't even sure she wanted to hear. "Why are you here, Luke?" "You know why." His response was immediate, as if he had been waiting for her to ask, and maybe he had been. "Say it," she demanded, her voice trembling. "I need to hear you say it." Luke took a step closer, closing the distance between them until there was barely an inch of space separating their bodies. His gaze never wavered from hers as he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "I'm in love with you, Emily," he said, his voice low and full of raw, unfiltered emotion. "I've been in love with you for a long time, and I know you feel it too." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of her. She had known. Of course, she had known. But hearing him say it out loud was something else entirely. It made it real. It made it impossible to ignore. Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as tears slipped down her cheeks. "Luke, But before she could finish, he was kissing her, his lips crashing down on her with a desperation that mirrored her own. She kissed him back, pouring every ounce of the emotion she had been holding back for so long into that one moment. It was like a dam had broken, and everything she had been trying to suppress came flooding out all at once. The fear, the longing, the love. It was all there, laid bare for him to see. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as they tried to catch their breath. "I'm scared," Emily admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm scared of what this means, of what happens next." Luke cupped her face in her hands, forcing her to look at him. "We figure it out together," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." And in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, Emily knew that she wasn't alone, that no matter what happened, she had him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Together. Luke's smile was radiant, full of the kind of hope and promise that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the rain continued to fall outside, but it no longer felt like a mockery. Instead, it felt like a cleansing, washing away the doubts and fears that had plagued her for so long. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future where she and Luke could be happy, where they could finally close the distance between them and find their way to each other.